At first glance, the strange twin-tailed fighter looked like an oversized reconnaissance plane. Slow, awkward, hardly a threat. Japanese pilots smirked as they closed in. But within minutes, entire formations of Zeros were tumbling into the sea, their reign of dominance broken in a single morning. This machine was no experiment. It was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, a Predator built for speed, altitude, and raw firepower. From shocking dogfights over New Guinea to the daring mission that brought down Admiral Yamamoto himself, the Lightning didn't just contest the skies. It redefined aerial combat, forever changing the course of World War II. When war erupted across the Pacific, one symbol dominated the skies: the Mitsubishi A6M0. Sleek, light, and impossibly maneuverable, it wasn't just an airplane, it was a terror made of steel. First unveiled over China and then unleashed at Pearl Harbor, the Zero was unlike anything American or British pilots had ever faced. Its climb rate outmatched almost every Allied machine. Its turning radius defied logic. And in the hands of Japan's elite naval aviators, it became a weapon of humiliation. In the Philippines, Burma, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, Zero formations cut through defenders with surgical precision. Pilots flying P-40 Warhawks or Buffaloes learned a deadly truth. If you tried to turn with a Zero, you were already dead. Allied losses mounted at a staggering pace. To ground troops watching from below, the Zero appeared untouchable, as though gravity and physics bent in its favor. This dominance wasn't accidental. Japan had spent the 1930s crafting a doctrine rooted in the philosophy of Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. The Imperial Navy believed its air arm should serve as the shield and spear of the fleet, annihilating any enemy before they could approach Japan's shores. To support this vision, their aviators were molded through brutal training regimens. These were not simply soldiers, they were craftsmen of destruction. They drilled endlessly in aerobatics, formation flying, and marksmanship. By late 1941, Japanese naval pilots were among the most skilled in the world, perhaps the most formidable cadre of fighter aces ever assembled. Across the ocean, the United States viewed air combat through outdated lenses. Fighters were thought of as escorts, defensive shadows for bombers rather than offensive hunters. Training was rushed, and the machines provided, like the Bell P-39 Airacobra, struggled at high altitudes where modern combat increasingly took place. The results were disastrous. In the Philippines alone, American squadrons were annihilated almost before they left the ground. By the end of 1941, Japan's aerial supremacy was so complete that it shaped every Allied decision in the Pacific. Soldiers feared the Zero, pilots whispered about it like a phantom, and planners wondered if anything could stop it. At that moment, it seemed inevitable. Japan owned the skies. But far from the front lines, in a California design office, a machine was already taking shape that would soon challenge this empire in the clouds. The United States knew it couldn't win the war with outdated ideas. After the bloodletting of the first months, desperation became the mother of invention. Pilots begged for something that could outclimb, outdive, and outlast the Zero. What emerged wasn't born from tradition, it came from defiance. At Lockheed's Burbank plant, a young engineer named Clarence Kelly Johnson envisioned a radical departure from everything fighters had been before. His concept rejected the idea of fragile, single-engine planes designed for nimble turning duels. Instead, he created a machine built around speed, altitude, and concentrated firepower. The Lockheed Model 22, soon to be christened the P-38 Lightning, looked like nothing else in the sky. Two engines mounted on twin booms flanked a central cockpit pod. giving the aircraft a silhouette so strange that observers often mistook it for a bomber or reconnaissance craft. Yet every detail had purpose. The twin Allison V1710 engines gave the Lightning over 2,000 combined horsepower, fed by turbo superchargers that allowed it to breathe at altitudes where most planes suffocated. Its maximum speed exceeded 400 miles per hour, and it could climb to over 40,000 feet, altitudes no Zero could reach. Even more revolutionary were its weapons. Instead of scattering guns across the wings, every weapon was concentrated in the nose. 4 50 caliber Browning machine guns and a 20mm cannon. This meant that when a P-38 pilot fired, the bullets and shells struck in a devastating unified stream, precise and lethal, far beyond the reach of wing-mounted guns. Equally important was philosophy. The Lightning was not built to circle endlessly with opponents. It was designed to fight vertically. Pilots were taught to dive from above with crushing speed, unleash fire, then climb back to safety before the enemy could react. It was war in 3 dimensions, a doctrine America badly needed. When the first squadrons of P-38s reached the Pacific in late 1942, they arrived just as morale was crumbling. New Guinea, the Solomons, and the seas around them were battlefields drenched in defeat. Japanese bombers struck with near impunity, their Zero escorts confident in every engagement. Against that backdrop, the Lightning was whispered about as a miracle machine, alien, ungainly, but perhaps the only hope of breaking Japan's stranglehold on the air. And when its engines roared to life over the jungles of Port Moresby, the Lightning would prove it was far more than a hope. It was the beginning of a revolution that would finally teach Japanese pilots fear. By late 1942, the skies over New Guinea had become a proving ground for survival. Japanese Zeros swept across the theater with terrifying confidence, escorting bombers that pounded Allied bases almost daily. For over a year, American pilots had been forced to fight with inferior machines, bleeding losses in combat they could never control. When the P-38 Lightning finally appeared at Port Moresby in December, it looked like something from another world. With its twin tails and hulking size, it was mocked as clumsy, even called 2 airplanes bolted together. But what mattered wasn't appearance. It was what happened when it took flight. On December 27th, Captain Thomas Lynch led a squadron of 12 Lightnings into the skies. Among them was a young farm boy from Wisconsin, Richard Bong, who would soon carve his name into history. Japanese pilots expected another easy engagement. They spotted the strange shapes and assumed they were reconnaissance craft or heavy fighters too slow to matter. With bomber formations to protect, they closed in. What followed shattered their illusions in minutes. From 25,000 feet, the Lightnings dived like thunderbolts. Their twin engines roared. Their nose-mounted cannons unleashed concentrated streams of fire. Zeros that tried to follow into the dive shook violently, their fragile frames at the edge of breaking apart. Those who attempted to climb after the Lightning stalled and fell helplessly back into the jungle canopy. In less than 10 minutes, the balance of the skies had shifted. Dozens of Japanese aircraft fell in flames, wreckage scattering across ocean and forest. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American pilots dictated the terms of battle. Word spread quickly across Japanese squadrons. The strange twin-tailed aircraft was no reconnaissance plane. It was a predator that could not be caught in the traditional turning duel. The Lightning's arrival marked the beginning of the end for Japan's air supremacy. What seemed at first like a curiosity became a nightmare that would haunt Japanese aviators for the rest of the war. The Lightning's greatest gift wasn't just its engines or its weapons, it was a new philosophy of aerial combat. American doctrine before 1942 had been shackled by tradition. Pilots were taught to fly in tight formations, protecting bombers rather than striking independently. The Zero thrived under these rules, pulling Allied fighters into horizontal spirals they couldn't win. But the P-38 demanded a new way of thinking. Its instructors drilled a single command into every Lightning pilot: never turn with a Zero. Instead, altitude became life insurance, and speed became survival. Tactics shifted from the flat, swirling duels of early Pacific battles to vertical strikes. Pilots climbed to great heights, stalked their prey from above, and plunged downward with lethal bursts before climbing again out of reach. This boom and zoom method, once theory, became gospel. The P-38's design made this style unavoidable. Its heavy frame bled speed in tight turns, but in dives it was unmatched. Zeros that attempted to pursue at high velocity risked structural collapse. In climbs, the Lightning's superchargers gave it strength the Japanese machines couldn't match. What emerged wasn't just an aircraft, but a battlefield reshaped. No longer a flat arena of spirals, the sky became a three-dimensional chessboard where Lightning pilots dictated every move. Training intensified. Pilots practiced high-speed yo-yos, chandelles, and barrel rolls designed to conserve energy while keeping guns locked on target. They learned to strike with cold patience, holding fire until the precise moment their nose-mounted arsenal would hit with devastating accuracy. Those who broke discipline and tried to dogfight paid with their lives, but those who embraced the doctrine carved victory after victory. This shift wasn't merely tactical, it was psychological. Japanese aviators, once celebrated as masters of close-in dueling, found themselves stripped of advantage. Their skills meant little when the fight refused to stay horizontal. Slowly, but relentlessly, the Zero's aura of invincibility began to crack. And with every battle fought under this new philosophy, the Lightning's reputation grew. It was no longer a curiosity, no longer a rumor whispered across airfields. It was the embodiment of a new age of combat, an age where altitude and speed, not tradition, decided who lived and who died. The P-38 Lightning was a machine, but it was men who turned it into legend. Among them stood three names that would become synonymous with mastery of the skies: Richard Bong, Thomas Lynch, and Thomas Maguire. Each pilot embodied a different face of the Lightning's doctrine, and together they showed the world just how devastating the aircraft could be. Richard Bong was hardly the image of a warrior. A farm boy from Wisconsin, quiet and modest, he carried into combat not bravado, but discipline. In the Lightning, that discipline became lethal. Bong mastered the art of patience, waiting until his target filled the gun sight before firing, holding his nerve where others might waste ammunition in desperation. His precision and calm transformed him into America's top ace, with 40 victories, a record that would never be surpassed. His approach proved that the Lightning wasn't about reckless duels, but about choosing the moment to strike with absolute certainty. Captain Thomas Lynch was a different breed. Bold, aggressive, he pushed the Lightning's vertical tactics to their limits. Lynch drilled his men to embrace the doctrine of altitude and speed, hammering into them the mantra: altitude is life insurance. Under his leadership, squadrons became disciplined predators, attacking in coordinated dives and climbing away before the enemy could respond. His 20 victories were less important than the tactical culture he left behind, a philosophy that saved lives and won battles long after his own death in 1944. Thomas Maguire was the wild card. Fiercely competitive, he treated the skies as an arena where daring innovation brought glory. Where Bong relied on restraint, Maguire leaned into aggression, inventing maneuvers like the Maguire roll to outthink his opponents. His 38 kills placed him just behind Bong, but his legacy was equally lasting. Together, their rivalry sharpened tactics across squadrons. These men weren't just aces, they were symbols. They embodied the Lightning's transformation from an experimental oddity into the scourge of Japan's air fleet. And as their victories piled up, so too did the realization that the Zero's supremacy had truly come to an end. The Lightning's true measure came not in isolated dogfights, but in battles that decided the fate of entire campaigns. One of the earliest and most decisive came in March 1943 during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. Japanese forces attempted to reinforce their garrisons in New Guinea, sending a convoy of transports and destroyers under heavy fighter protection. For the Allies, stopping that convoy was critical. Without success, New Guinea might remain in enemy hands. When Allied bombers swept in, P-38s were there to clear the skies. Diving from altitude, the Lightnings tore into the Zero escorts before they could reach the bombers. Japanese fighters tried to turn the engagement into spirals of close combat, but the Lightning pilots refused the trap. They struck hard and fast, scattering the enemy long enough for the bombers to release their deadly cargo. What followed was chaos at sea. Skip bombing runs at mast height, transports erupting in fire, destroyers shredded and sinking. By the battle's end, 8 transports and 4 destroyers were lost. Japanese reinforcements never arrived. The convoy had been obliterated, and the balance in New Guinea shifted. This wasn't just a tactical victory, it was strategic proof. The Lightning had become more than an aircraft. It was the shield that allowed Allied bombers to strike deep, and the sword that severed Japan's supply lines. Every successful mission reinforced confidence among American crews and spread despair through Japanese ranks. Reports from enemy pilots increasingly described helplessness against the twin-tailed demons diving from the sun. By early 1943, the P-38 had rewritten the rules of engagement. Where once the Zero dictated terms, now it was forced into reactive defense. The Lightning's endurance allowed bombers to press further. Its firepower silenced enemy formations, and its speed gave pilots the choice of when to fight and when to vanish. The Pacific skies were no longer Japan's domain. They belonged to the Lightning. April 18, 1943, was no ordinary day. It was the moment when technology, intelligence, and audacity intersected, and the Lightning was at the center of it. American codebreakers had intercepted the itinerary of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and the mastermind behind Japan's naval strategy. He was scheduled to fly from Rabaul to Bougainville to inspect frontline positions. For the United States, it was an opportunity unlike any other. If Yamamoto could be eliminated, Japan would suffer not just a military loss, but a psychological blow that would echo across the empire. There was only one aircraft capable of pulling off the mission. The route demanded a 435-mile overwater flight from Guadalcanal, far beyond the reach of most fighters. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin engines and long range, was the only choice. 16 Lightnings of the 339th Fighter Squadron took off at dawn under the command of Major John Mitchell. They flew at wave-top height for hours, engines just above the spray, maintaining strict radio silence to avoid detection. Precision navigation was critical. One error, and they would miss the intercept entirely. At 9:34 a.m., Yamamoto's aircraft appeared. 2 Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers with 6 Zero escorts. The Lightnings struck from below with surgical timing. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber dove on the formation. Barber's cannon fire ripped into Yamamoto's bomber, sending it spiraling into the jungle below. The man who had planned Pearl Harbor's devastation was gone. The mission became known as Operation Vengeance, and its impact was seismic. For Japan, it was a devastating blow to morale. Yamamoto was revered as both a strategist and a symbol of naval pride. His death shook confidence in a war that already seemed to be slipping away. For the United States, the mission was a statement. Not even Japan's most protected leader was beyond reach. The Lightning had proven it could not only dominate the battlefield, but deliver strategic justice across vast distances. By late 1943, the aura of Japanese dominance had collapsed. The Zero, once untouchable, was now vulnerable, and its pilots faced a new reality they were unprepared for. Entire air groups that had entered the year with dozens of seasoned aviators returned home with only a handful of survivors. The 251st Air Group, once feared, ended 1943 with fewer than 10 experienced pilots. The 204th lost 70% of its aviators in just 6 months. The problem wasn't just combat, it was replacement. Japan's training pipeline, once long and rigorous, was shortened drastically under wartime strain. By 1943, new pilots were arriving at the front with as little as 100 flight hours. Many had never flown above 20,000 feet before encountering P-38s. They faced opponents armed with superior machines, backed by endless industrial output, and seasoned by months of combat experience. Against that imbalance, they were slaughtered. Allied pilots, meanwhile, gained confidence. The Lightning's rugged frame could absorb punishment. Its twin engines offered safety during long overwater missions, and its range allowed escorts deeper than ever before. Air-sea rescue operations plucked many survivors from the ocean, ensuring that experience wasn't wasted. Each loss could be replaced. Each Japanese defeat widened the gulf. By late 1943, Japanese commanders admitted the unthinkable. The Zero was no longer supreme. Reports urged pilots to avoid lightning formations at high altitude, to engage only in desperation, and to disengage quickly if pressed. This doctrine, so defensive, so cautious, was anathema to a warrior culture built on aggression. It was also humiliating. The consequences spread across the Pacific. Japanese convoys now moved only at night, their daylight movements shredded by lightning patrols. Supply lines shrank, reinforcements dwindled, and once proud squadrons were reduced to shadows. The empire that had once ruled the skies found itself caged, forced onto the defensive. The Zero entered the war as a legend, but by the close of 1943, it was a relic. The Lightning had stolen its crown, and with it, the future of the Pacific War tilted toward Allied victory. Allied victory. Allied